Okay, welcome to another KAPcast, and our special guest today is Dr. Mark McGovern. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Robbie, and welcome everyone.
And today we're talking about economics and infrastructure challenges and opportunities. And first of all, Mark, I've known you probably a little over 10 years now, but I knew of you before then. And I knew you were a lecturer at QUT, and as I understand, you were head of economics at this business school at QUT in Brisbane.
Yeah.
Queensland University of Technology. Can you give us a little bit more of your background? I've got some stuff written here, but I'd much prefer you to go through your background.
Well, basically, I was there for almost 3 decades, and I had a range of research areas, and also I was lecturing. So two things that come through in all that is that I had a long-term look at things like rural and regional development. I did my Masters in Regional Development, Regional Science it was, and then I did my PhD. I looked at impact analysis, and I used the sugar industry as an example. And that was before I came to QUT. But with that background, I then was very interested in industries and regions and how they get on. Also, partly because of the subjects I did, I actually got to understand the theory better and could see the problems in the existing economic theory that's quite popular now. And basically, the way I'd sum it up is that over almost 3 decades of lecturing across a range of subjects, everything from business in Europe to industry analysis and regulation and international economics is where I ended up. So I actually could see from each of these areas the strengths and the weaknesses.
Yep.
Right.
This is what makes you a fascinating person for me, Mark, and I think many, is that most of your career was spent in that dynamic change, the growth of neoliberalism, the globalisation, and the free markets, and
Yep.
you know, my contention has always been that it's everything in space, you know, everything done in measure, but it was such a binary sort of approach to it. Like everything had to be fully free market, and the neoliberals just sort of had a tsunami of effort in that one direction, and you're just you explaining that background now explains to me a lot, because from a practical approach, you're seeing where the failures were.
Yep.
And trying to reconcile that with desired outcomes from the government and all these failures, that you started to question it and put you apart from a lot of that mainstream thinking, which I think puts you directly in the right place.
Yeah, and also some of the theory I picked up on, I saw the limitations in the theoretical side. And
Yep.
really what we had was a new dogma arrived. You either believed in markets or you were shunned. Yeah.
Right.
It's like a religious
It's real zealotry, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, neoclassical economics has got some very good things about it, but it's got its limitations. Same as everything.
Yeah.
Right? And basically what happened was the market push came in the mid-70s, and that then rolled out in Australia through the 80s. And so by the time I was at QUT lecturing in the first years, for example, I was just at the tail of the old understanding. And after a few years, different parts of the content which were previously quite important just disappeared from economics. So basically anyone under about mid-40s who went to university has missed a lot.
So give me an example of like at one point in your career when you thought, crikey, this doesn't add up. I'm not sure that this is a good thing, because, you know, you talk about the sugar industry, or what was a turning point for you where you thought, actually, there's some solid evidence here that there's flaws in this theory and these ideologies?
Yeah. Well, I could be one from lecturing first years. I was just going through it. I've done it a couple of times by this stage. And I just went through the theory of what the market price is. And the first part is to do with margin, revenue and cost. That's fine. That's a rule. But the second part says, providing the price exceeds the average variable cost, not average total cost, right? So the markets will keep you going as long as you can meet your variable cost. Because what that means is you're not making enough to cover your debts. So players stay in the markets because the market will take your stuff and you'll go to the market, providing you can meet your variable costs. That variable costs do not incur your capital costs. And that includes, you know, in the case of the farm, bringing up the new generations and all this sort of stuff. It doesn't include looking after your land. In fact, one of the really ridiculous things is we don't actually allow depreciation of land, but we do of factories. And so there's a range of things there that I think are, how can I call it, at the very basic level, right? And the other thing that happened is production theory was basically kicked out of the curriculum because it was about markets. And this whole synthesis was bringing together the production side and the markets. And as I just explained, the markets sort of wobble around, but providing over time the returns are there, you're okay. But what's happened is we've forgotten about the over time, we've forgotten about the production needs, and we've been very naive. So the idea was quite simple, but it's quite powerful. So we've got this problem that's there. And before just when the Howard government got in for the first time, I was asked by Landcare to address this area in a meeting in Canberra, right? And I raised this point, and it was one of those several things. And of course, I went through neoclassical economics, and what was fascinating at the end was the room split. It was complete, it couldn't be so, it must be so, sort of. And so, but instead of then saying, let's talk about it further, they took a vote, and of course the vote went against. The chairman had to cast the vote, right? So that goes to the point of policy. If you've got ideas, and one the DPI bloke from Perth at that meeting basically said, I thought all this stuff was really obvious. And so I said, I'm not going to go if that's all it's about. But he said, I went around the room and I asked people in the office, right? And he said, most of them didn't understand it or didn't even know about it. So we've got three things going on. We've got theory being treated as gospel.
Yes.
Right? And intolerance abides with everything else. Secondly, we have differences in education which have allowed us to highlight different areas, which is not a bad thing. But we've forgotten some pretty important areas. We're throwing out too much. And the third thing is when we discuss things, we seek to go, let's go to a vote or something like that, instead of saying, hey, the problem needs some more work. And that, I think, goes to where we are today in Australia. We've got problems. We know the theories that are being used have got weaknesses, and we can look at those weaknesses and we can build better policies because of them. Right? And so we've got a whole possibility here to actually think afresh by recognising some of the things we've forgotten, which were part of our past successes. I'm not saying you can't have markets, that's obviously part of it, but you can't just have markets because, as I've mentioned, market models just don't work in the longer term.
Yeah, I mean, what you describe, I often hear the term groupthink seems to exist, neoclassical economics, and it seems to be completely intolerant of alternate views. You saw that clearly in your field. And was there many people and many other independent thinkers like yourself there that just
some of the staff have been around a while, they sort of agreed, and those who are in fresh wanted to change the world, which is what we always want to do, right? Yeah. People like to do things. But so we threw out things. And another area where there's been intolerance is monetarism and all this sort of stuff. They've taken one model of money and they think it does the job. It doesn't. And so this is part of why international monetary systems usually last on average about 29 years, right? And we've gone through the Bretton Woods one broke down, and then we've had what I called a rollover and up, where we sort of just let the banking system build up. Then we had problems in 2000, and now we're in the double down, and we've doubled down again, where we say the problems will go away if we can just keep managing the price of money through interest. And it's not going to solve anything.
Yeah,
it will create immediate things, but in today's ABC news site, one of the lead articles was young couple in debt trap, right? Because they're now having trouble getting refinanced. Now, we saw this with the Rural Debt and Drought Task Force. That was at the heart of what we saw in the rural sector back in 2014, 15, 16.
Yep.
That the ability to refinance because conditions had changed and there wasn't a flexibility in the loan products or the ability of the financial system to accommodate this properly. That's what happened. And we're doing the same thing today. We've had a Royal Commission, we learnt nothing.
Well, a lot of the a lot of the academics would say, so with the Rural Debt and Drought Task Force, and that was something that I put together in Parliament, and you're a part of, Mark. A very key part of that was trying to provide some recommendations of how to deal with what was an 8-year drought, and it was more than just the drought. That was the catalyst for exposing that debt position in the rural industry. But there would be those, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that would say, well, that's part of the natural cycle of markets. But my problem with that, and you might offer some more problems associated with that, is that they're fragile. It's a fragile little ecosystem, like the family farming unit, small private enterprise, and trying to convince someone to move to the back of Cunnamulla or Windora or Cloncurry to buy and live out in a station and operate that. And when you disrupt that and it becomes large institutional buyers or, just bigger families knocking out smaller, then there's I'd almost say an irreparable damage to the social fabric, which I think really links to our economic fabric as well of what we have. Do you see that as a problem?
Yeah, I think if we step back and just think about a large part of economic development is making the best use of your resources. Now, the key word is, what does best mean? Does that mean people living in communities in the areas?
Yes.
Or does it mean fly-out workers? We saw that in the coal industry and mining more generally, right? And we've now got a situation where, we've got areas locked up for carbon farming, for example, where there's hardly anyone around because it's seen as a static asset, but the pests multiply, but nothing much is done about them because they're not in the picture.
Yeah.
We've got. So
that's the cattle stations that are locked up for the carbon farming, but they were working, operating cattle stations. A lot of them, they're just locked up now, and they're farms for feral pigs and dogs and cats. And
and part of this was inevitable when we went away from sheep because sheep is labour intensive, and sheep need workers a couple of times a year. But on the other hand, cattle don't need as much care, but they do need some. But so part of it was the product mix. But part of what we can also look at the moment is, given the new technologies with solar and hydrogen and all this sort of stuff, there's a whole new area that could be opening up for rural communities, which could do it on a local rather than a fly-in basis. But the whole push away from sort of looking after people in the community like the early Queensland coal town was done, that was actually funded on a basis that we have to build schools to look at, and skills to look at what was going on if we want the mines to succeed. And the Queensland government negotiated quite sensibly to get some of the funds to do these sorts of things as part of the deal. What we're now doing is we're expecting the investor to come in and have their way, basically, and without putting up the community interests as an appropriate consideration and the regional development issue. Right? The parts of Queensland go through cycles. There's no perfect solution. Everyone's going to have a problem. But the problem in today's one is that we've reduced the available population. We're reducing the quality of a lot of the lands as well. And we won't go into the detail of that, but we don't give any incentives for stewardship of land. It's expected to be almost free. Right? Or something that has to be administered. So there's an area there. If we're concerned about the environment, there should be jobs in the region, stuff, as well as the energy industry. So these are all bigger questions, but one way we can pull it together is to say, what are our regional development priorities?
Yeah, well, I like that point because you said before there was, so with mining and coal mining and trying to get the economic benefit, they've rolled it out, and I'm of the view that they didn't think about it at all. I don't think it was a deliberate shift to FIFO. It was just, let's see what happens, and let's try and deregulate the labour force a lot more so there's more fluidity, and that invited in contract workforce and FIFO, and entirely destructive to many mining communities, including the one I live in, Mount Isa. And but I would say it's more a function of just complacency. I think there's a happy correlation, I think, with being lazy in government and the economic ideology of, small government and deregulation and, those neoclassical sort of principles, because a lot of it means do nothing, which suits a lazy government, doesn't it?
Well, governments can be lazy, even in, the most conscientious ones can be lazy at times, but I think it goes a bit deeper than just sort of, I don't think there's the understanding that there needs to be. The idea that markets can deliver everything is just rubbish.
Yes.
Right? Markets can do some things really well.
Yep.
But we need to condition markets if we're to get the social gains from them. And the way we condition markets is to address externalities and all that. We can go through the theory, but it's basically saying, is there a community impact here which needs to be attended to? And what are the positive community impacts? And so part of the situation in Australia with our current gas story, where we're making the gas but we can't get enough for ourselves, that's a failure to ask a really simple question. And the question is, how much of this production is actually benefiting the country? And so it's a production understanding and how that can be well addressed in the markets under some conditions, but where are you likely to get failures? Markets do fail. If we recognise market failures, that's where the government has a role from the start and needs to step in.
Yeah. And when you say government, we're not just talking about the elected members there. There's a whole cohort and treasury that observe this stuff and should know better and should be feeding that stuff up. But I question whether there's ever even any discussion at that level. I've never been in government, so I couldn't comment, but it's pretty hard to see that any of that discussion ever even happens to identify these market failures before even beginning to try and solve them.
Yeah, I think the Coldrake Commission's comment that there's been a de-skilling of the public service. I think there are some very good people in the public service. There always have been, there will be, and there are also some who are better off elsewhere, right? But basically with the de-skilling, and this goes to things like infrastructure evaluation, there's not the skills there to do it properly, it seems. When we look at the studies I've been doing on infrastructure, the reports are at a really basic level, and they're not fit for purpose. They're certainly not things you should be putting $1 billion into anything like. Right? So we actually need to go and look at the education and the recognition and the the credence given to the public sector. I think the public sector has been pushed out of the way very inappropriately. For quite a few years, I assisted main roads with infrastructure discussions and things like this. And they had some great people and they were really concerned and they were conscientious. I don't know what the situation is now, but certainly some of the things that were not appropriate previously are now seen as run-of-the-mill. But I think it's the rundown of the public sector generally that's part of the problem. If you become a public servant, you get snared by the consultant so you can come back as an advisor, right? And so things like that. And that's a market solution, but we should have had a public response to it, where people feel the public sector is worth being in for the long term.
Yeah, I don't think it pays to be too brave in the public service these days. I don't think that's a good, career pathways, saying some brave things to the government that they need to hear sometimes.
Well, I'd say there's an element of that, and that's in reports we've seen now. We've had,
I think the Coldrake report falls well short of adequately dealing with that because, like you say, I agree. There is some talent, there is some ability in there, but whether they get the latitude to express or pull up the government or where it's inconvenient for them. Yeah,
and it's not just in Brisbane; it's in Canberra. It's in the states. It's in local governments in some areas.
So infrastructure's that's one that gets the juices flowing for me, Mark. Probably because I live in such a resource-rich area that's really still in its close to its virgin state. There's just so much development potential in the north that it's easy to get excited about what the possibilities are.
Yeah.
And like you say, it's making sure those possibilities are converted to some benefit to people in the communities, not just this nebulous type of economic benefit that a few individuals or just a few entities get the benefit from. But yeah, infrastructure becomes an interesting one, and I notice when people talk to me and will say, "Oh, you just want more stuff out west, Rob," and I think, well, I'm not the one asking for cross river rail or Ferris wheels or water slides. I'm the one asking for the rail lines to make you guys more money. That's what I think that's where it seems to be a big difference between what the KAP seem to talk about in Parliament and what I hear the other MPs is. It's sort of populist-driven infrastructure rather than stuff that can make the state wealthy. And I'm sure there's some economic principles behind that you might be able to tease out.
Well, basically the trouble is there's not much economics anymore. It's become a form-filling exercise where you make some assumptions and you come up with the answer that you hope you'll get in some cases. I mean, I can give a couple of examples. One is that there's a commitment to a project, it seems, before it starts, before it's even evaluated. Right? We want. It doesn't matter. So we're not building to budget. We are building to aspiration.
Yeah,
right.
It's a good line.
Now, we need to get back to building to budget because we've got ridiculous cost overruns. And at the moment in Queensland, we've got public works on the books that double our ability to build them. Right? Infrastructure Australia reported this last October.
Say that again?
That the amount of work proposed in public infrastructure in Queensland is twice the ability of our Queensland workforce to deliver. Same in Victoria, same in Tasmania, and New South Wales is pretty close to capacity. So what's going to happen when all these projects try and get to market? The prices are just going to go silly. You lose control of your costs. But there's not even this prioritisation of projects to say that this is most worthy on these social and economic and financial grounds. It's basically, this is a good project, it's stacked up on the business case, let's go. So there's a loss of overall oversight. We haven't got a position where we actually understand what we're trying to do in a sensible way that we can avoid delays due to inability to get workers or parts or base resources. And, to have a workbook twice the size of the ability to deliver for the next couple of years, and probably more after that, similarly. And then the deeper question is, how on earth do you pay for some of these things when there's no economic return?
So explain that to me because, that I know that in their head they're saying, well, it stimulates the construction industry and there's jobs through the construction phase and there's some magical element after that. And I've never been sure how they quantify that, but there just seems to, especially sports stadiums and the like, that they contribute all this additional business. Let's talk about Cross River Rail. I think when I first entered Parliament in 2012, 2011, it was all campaigned from Liberal and Labor about a $3 or $4 billion project, which I learnt was going to get people to work 10 minutes earlier. And I'd never heard anyone, I've got a lot of family and friends, but no one had said, crikey, it'd be good to fix that congestion getting across the river, or it'd be great to get to, that's a real priority for the state. But it seemed to just, and Infrastructure Australia wasn't prioritising it, and it just popped out, and now it's a $7 billion project, and I'm still not sure why it's a priority over, let's say, the M1 or the Bruce Highway or, countless other infrastructure projects.
I think the people who made the decision know that. I can't speculate on why they liked it, but I can say that if you look at the economic returns from something like that, they're not particularly easy to quantify and they're not necessarily that major. And I'll give you another example, which is on the Gold Coast, which is the extension of the light rail. That project, which has just been signed off in March, has gone from a under 700 million project to 1.5 billion before it even starts. There's been no serious work and it's doubled, right? It also has, because the money's being borrowed and also because there's other charges involved, it's going to cost, on estimates, $100 million every year for 30 years to keep it going, right? Now, all that information has been given to government ministers and the media and this sort of stuff for over a year now, getting closer to. If we go to the business case found that there would be no increase in patronage. Travel times are much the same, right? And basically that more congestion could follow. So what we've done is we've created a pure liability, not an asset. We've created a pure liability, which is going to cost us a lot of money for no real economic returns. Now, in terms of the way some of the economic benefits were calculated, there was $25 million because people would have to walk further from the tram stop than they would from a bus stop. So there was a health benefit. So that's $25 million, right?
Yeah,
we look at the Coomera connector. There's going to be travel time savings, right? And they're going to get home earlier. But that's not money. That's time that people have, which is great. But where do you pay the bills, right? And if we come back to the light rail, there's the whole issue of how a single link so expensively is superior to what we could do with new technologies, like the electric buses are already rolling out on the coast, which is great, and hydrogen buses are rolling out at Emerald, I understand. So why aren't we looking at these new technologies which we could do for a better service for 20 to 30% of the cost, optimistically, and we could even make some of them free, right?
I often think I wish they applied those same business case, those models, like with the, saving time and the health benefit to, say, the Hughenden Dam that we want to build on the Flinders River.
Well, that's right. You see, what we're doing is we're not using objective measures, we're using subjective estimates.
Right.
But if we get to the real heart of the matter here in terms of finance, there is no extra revenue generated. And yet we're spending $1.5 billion.
So where does that end up?
Sri Lanka.
How does that... Sorry?
Sri Lanka, right? Yes. One of the things...
That's the projection you're on.
Well, I supervised a PhD student. We looked at what was going on over there.
Yeah.
They weren't evaluating the projects properly, right? They were taking on debts without an income source, and so you end up with Sri Lanka today, right? We did the PhD 10 years ago now, but it was always evident because of this. Now, I'm not saying that all Queensland government borrowings and debts are ridiculous, not at all. But I'm saying there is a possibility with things like the light rail, which gives you, it's a pure liability. You've got to find money elsewhere. So do you take it out of schools or do you take it from somewhere else? How do you actually fund that except by borrowing? And if you're going to borrow, where are you going to get the extra growth in the economy? Now, it's not actually a proper commuter either, because most of the people are retirees in the areas where it's going to service, or there are some, but there's not a lot of commuting involved. So it's a project which has negligible financial returns.
Yep.
And it has a supposed economic benefit, which is fairly flaky, really. I mean, most of the benefits from congestion were to car drivers. So why do you build public transport to help car drivers, but then they say elsewhere in the report, but there will be more congestion. So it's contradictory as well. So where we can go straight to the heart of this is, where's the assessment quality being monitored? Where's the project oversight? Now, this used to exist in places like main roads, because I saw it on a regular basis. It's gone.
Right.
We're not building the budget. We need to change that. And let's go back to Coldrake's comment. We need to rebuild the public service with the skills to do these things and to be able to report in a way which is proper, right, and is skilled and considers the reasonable interests of the state in a proper way.
And I would add to that, though, they need not only skills but the latitude to be able to articulate and feel free to say that without fear of recourse of being, might be sacked from the job, but they're shifted sideways or promised never to progress in that department ever if they keep standing up and saying things aren't going to work, aren't convenient to the government of the day.
Yeah, and I think that goes for organisations generally. But the governments at the moment, we've had this idea that public servants are a liability, basically, because they cost you money in the budget, whereas you could be spending on other things, or get consultants in right? We could have a circus. Well, we've got a circus now, and it's not working very well.
Mark, I want to jump back to something we were talking about earlier, and it was talking about debt and finance and the impact in agriculture,
Yep.
which is something I have involved intimately with in an area where I live, but there's always been a problem with finance, and I always remember listening to you on the radio as a forum on foreign investment, and it was at the time there was a lot of discussion about it because there was a lot more movement in the market shifting away from the family farm, the smaller family unit buying places and new participants in, say, the cattle grazing industry trying to buy a cattle station just being edged out by the big institutional buyers, big corporates, a lot of foreign ownership, and it generates a bit of discussion. But you've made some comments around that I thought were about what the impact was, asking the questions of how we're there, and I thought that was that summed it up quite well of where we can look at doing things better in the rural finance industry.
Yeah. Basically, a lot of the overseas investors were acquiring assets for long-term purposes, and they had access to cheap money. Right? They had long-term
access and availability and affordability of capital.
Yes.
Your loans. Yeah.
So that was a big part of the story. Now, Australia used to have that. Right? We did have arrangements where farmers were given concessional finance because of the risk positions. Right? And we also, because of risk considerations. You basically, if you pool a whole lot of loans together, let's I'll give an example from the sugar industry. I was talking to the Queensland Sugar Board, someone there one day, and I said, what do you do about managing risk? Well, I said, 1,200 k's of farms, it pretty well averages itself because weather conditions along the whole growing area balance out, right? So if you can do that, say, across Australian wheat or beef or something like this, there'll be good and bad seasons in different parts. So that's one way to manage risk. But the inward investors weren't so much worried about that sort of risk. They were more just here for the long-term capital appreciation. And so prices moved away from income. And as I say, let's go back to earlier on where we said, the prices in the market don't necessarily reflect the ability to repay it.
No.
Right? So your local bidder competes with someone who's got cheaper finance, they're not that concerned, and they're able to offset risk through tax system and all that sort of stuff more effectively than a sole trader or a small family enterprise of some sort.
The point I took at the time was that you'd said, the discussion was all about foreign ownership, and I think you took it sideways to say, well, I think you're asking the wrong questions. You've got to ask why they are out competing with our family farmers in buying those places, and there's been an opportunity created for them, a platform for them to outcompete. Then do we accept that situation? And what are the motivators behind their governments providing them a platform to outcompete with ours? And should we be doing the same, at least to even if to a lesser extent, be doing the same? Because is it food security that's driving that, or is there incentive? Do we consider family farm or the family farm unit, or trying to incentivise new and innovative producers into the market that can buy their own production unit, so buy their small farm, because then you might have incentivised loans for them, but that doesn't seem to just be on the radar for a government. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I think what I was wandering around in circles, you summed up in the first half of what you just said. Right? I think, why aren't we looking at the options in a way which considers our own communities and the national interest?
Yes.
Different countries do this.
Yeah.
Right? The Biden's electric vehicle policy says quite clearly we want to move the supply chain into the US, not in China. Right? Americans are quite happy to do this. The Europeans decided at the start of the European Union that, back in the 50s, that we don't want to starve again. So they had the common agricultural policy. Yet we had Australians being sent overseas to tell the Europeans they were silly because they wouldn't do the markets like we do. But they had a priority, and it was food security was important. And also they gave payments for things like landscape amenity, right, which is a subsidy, but they were prepared to give subsidy because they were part of their nation's aspirations.
What about the the composition of ownership? Because I don't really want to live. I mean, this is an emotional type response, but I don't want to live in a world that's just owned where three big families and big corporations own all the cattle stations. You want to live in a world where there's a chance for a young bloke that's really cutting edge, has got a lot to bring the industry, but doesn't want to work for someone else, who's only going to be incentivised to participate in the industry if he can run his own show. And I mean, move outside of pastoral activity, just about every pursuit now, they're closing off those opportunities of. And I feel like that neoclassical, the free market ideology is sort of invited in that dominance by big players and to the exclusion of smaller private enterprise. And I think in so many ways in Australia we're paying the price for that, whether it's mentally, having a mental impact on people that don't get those opportunities, and economic opportunities and landscape. Land husbandry, not getting the right people in to manage these places.
Yeah, I think unfortunately history has been against what you're talking about for the last 20, 30 years. What we can expect is that the current system is failing, right? People are paying over the top to get bigger and bigger, and there's not the economic returns eventually. And so the cycle turns. So in 20, 30 years' time, it could be that this will regress itself. What we need to do to make a smooth transition is basically to say, okay, we have some situations here where we want to move towards these. What are the ways we can work out to do it? We don't have to run around doing silly things immediately. We say, okay, how do we set up a basis for achieving what we really want to? Rather than simply saying a farm is only a single product enterprise. It's called cattle. That's it. If that's all that's in your model, that's all you think about. What we need to say, a farm is a resource manager, right, which brings up the issue of stewardship and part of a community. And it also needs to be an economically viable unit under a range of conditions. And we can set those. And see, one of the big problems that's come about with the reduction of the rural workforce is that previously, if you had a drought or something, you could say to the workers, I'm sorry, but I can't use you, and they go into town, and the government would support them on the dole. But if you now have got no one to set the farm there, and it's a bad time, you can always go to the banker and say, sorry, I can't pay, but the banker won't go along with it. Right? They'll say, well, we're going to have to sell you up. So we actually need to build in the realities of production. Right? We need to say production doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not a perfect environment. There are risks, there are things that arise, and there are things beside the product beef. We need to actually say it's a multifunctional enterprise. And multifunctionality, when I use that, as Europeans use it, it's the phrase they use for the farm does many things. So if we have multifunctionality, if you mention that in Canberra, you'll be very unpopular. Multifunctionality is the European term for treating the farm as having multiple functions. Yes. In Australia, we've gone to this idea that you're one function. You produce beef or wheat. Right. You produce a commodity, basically. But it's not even...
Which doesn't... I mean, the larger units, get big or get out, and these bigger... I'm not going to say they're all linear or just one-dimensional with their... but they do seem to... I remember a big sugar farmer saying that to me once, as saying, well, get big or get out's not great for us, because in sugar you become really beholden to just that one income stream of sugar. You're geared up heavily just to that commodity, where the smaller bloke can go do a bit of contract work in town at the council, or he could diversify his income and work and ride the cycles, the commodity cycles, a lot more effectively. So, and that was a mantra at the time that was just a given, and it was, sugar industry, get big or get out. And you think, well, that's really false. There's a lot of flaws in that. Approach, but it was just supposed to be adopted as a fact. That
the economies of scale aren't there, nor are the economies of size. And I actually was when what's his name, Ludwig was the federal ag minister. I was talking there to some advisors, and I said, "What's your estimate of the gain?" And they said about 10%. Right? And I said, "Where'd you get that from?" "Oh, that's just what it is." So there's no underlying,
no rigour behind it.
There's no rigour, right?
No.
And
not surprising.
And I'll give you another example. Once again from sugar, I was up North Queensland, right up near the foothills of a hill once back in the day, and I said to the farmer who was showing me around, I said, "Oh, that's a beautiful spot over there." And he said, "Yeah, it is lovely. Unfortunately, under the system that they had then, I've got to expand my land, so I'm going to clear it." He didn't really want to clear it.
Yes.
But under the arrangement, this was the old arrangement, this was a regulated system, so it's not just markets that have problems. The way the regulations work then. Now, if we had have said, okay, that's a resource, and we're prepared to support the management of that, and make it a park, make access to it, and all this sort of stuff, we'd still have that natural resource there. And that what we had was, as the costs rose, people had to push to the boundaries.
Yep.
And the same things happened as we run down the quality of land. Say farmers who are cash strapped have to, if they're going to keep ahead of their obligations, they end up exploiting the land. And some big farmers do this too, and it's not just the small ones.
No, the mulga, out that mulga country out near Charleville, I've seen examples exactly the same thing, where they're so inefficient, the regulations, and so ill-conceived that it actually can promote poorer practice, land management practice. If you completely unregulated it, you'd end up with much better land management outcomes. But,
where I think you've got to have is a dialogue. You've got to basically, the farmer and the representative of the public, used to be DPI or someone like that, but we don't have too much of that around, basically say, how can we manage this resource for the wider benefit as well as your long-term viability? So
getting back to the real debt, and a lot of the commodities are doing pretty well at the moment. And so it's not like there's a lot of people need help at the moment. But all the same, when you are trying to ride things, I always I didn't feel it. I mean, there was empirical evidence to back this up, but there was, if the government's help the industry, not only was the rural banking industry too rigid to accommodate for the vagaries of agriculture with your weather, commodity prices, that sort of thing, but and that came, to both of us straight through the horse's mouth from people inside the system now, just saying, look, some of our products just aren't fit for purpose in the rural industry, but also, it's pretty easy to demonstrate that the interest paid on debt is the largest component of their balance, of their profit and loss. So, they do subsidies of diesel, fodder subsidies, or, these diesel subsidies and things. But in actual fact, for value for money for the taxpayer, they're much better trying to involve the government in that lending space. So why doesn't it happen? Why is there that reluctance to government? They'll do add-on loan products, but they'll never just bring out a government bank to fully fund some of those things where the taxpayer can make money off it. It's the best bang for the buck to give a benefit and to stimulate agriculture. Why don't we just adopt the government bank model?
If I just step back one, I'd say rather than use the phrase government help, government can work with. And banks can work with. We've got to start working with each other and play to our strengths. Now, that goes to the point about a public bank. Public banks do have some strengths, and the commercial banks have got their strengths and weaknesses also. What we need to do is work out what's the nature of the problem you're trying to solve, and then what's an appropriate solution. We've gone to this idea that, the one shoe fits all. Basically, there's always the best way. No, there are lots of good ways. And if we
I I agree, because you don't want to finance available to everyone. But there's, my contention was, if Rob Katter's the latest, greatest, best farmer in the district, but and got a young 4 kids moving into a small town to fill up the school again, but my biggest problem is attaining finance, and there's a bias in the system where someone who's inherited their property in the district looks better on the balance sheet and is more likely to get the loan for the next door neighbour's property than me, when I think the public benefit would be better served if I got the loan, because I'm going to bring new blood into the industry, new expertise, new energy, a new family into town, and the system. I'm not saying I'm not saying the bloke that next door that inherited probably should get the same level of finance, but there should be a product for me that backs and incentivises those people. And the government would say, well, we've got a scheme, but I think it's hardly worth talking about. It's flawed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fair to say, what's the opportunity here, and
Right.
and what are the ways we could solve it? And if you've got a bit of a mix, I mean, family farms have got their strengths. Some corporate farms have got some strengths too. Other corporate farms are quite exploitive. That's a strength to them, but it's not to the public. I mean, this is getting to really basic stuff. It's in terms of, we really need to basically negotiate an outcome that suits us all. Instead of that, we're just taking standard products off the shelf, which are there for a particular advantage. In the case of banking, it's there to ensure that the bank gets its money back, and it's got nothing to do with food. It's got nothing to do with community, right? And so that, at the end of the day, becomes the driver. The one with the most power, which in the current situation is the financier, wins, and everything else suffers accordingly. We've got to work towards a system where we have a range of considerations in play, and that there's discussion and saying how we manage these.
Yes.
And it's, how can I call it? It may sound idealistic, but on the other hand, lots of other countries do it. We've got into a lazy man's trap or a lazy lady's trap of going for a slogan rather than a solution.
Yep. Look, Mark, I love the fact that you're always asking the questions. You're not telling, you're not acting like the other side and acting with authority like everything you're saying is right, but just asking the questions. That's the important thing, to keep putting those questions to them and putting them fearlessly back to the mainstream, that's sort of insisting on that's their way or the highway. And we've lived through that the last 30 years, and I think it's brought upon some diabolical results.
And we've got some serious risks we've got to face. And that goes back to the reform of the banking system, which a public bank would be part of, done properly. I mean, I'm not saying the public takes over banking. What I am saying is there are clear roles for a public bank. And the Reserve Bank is a public bank. It's
amazing that people from who I wouldn't agree with ideologically on many things in economics, who have brought that same proposition to me as an interrupter in the market to the banking, is to bring in the government bank, even as it's really staying true to that market theory for them, but it's introducing the government to try and moderate the operation of the banks. I mean, I should mention to you, I hadn't spoken to you a while, but you go try and get a loan for a house out in any of the small towns that I represent now, they'll ask you for 50% deposit. And, I hear stories from people trying to sell a $150,000 house in a small town like Dewey Creek, Richmond, Huon, and the bank said, look, we can lend you $600,000 in Townsville, but you're going to have to come up with 50% deposit for your 150 grand or 200 grand in that small town, which makes it. And the banks will never say we don't do lending there. Yes, they do lending, but on terms that are just completely unviable.
Yeah.
And so there's complete failure, market failure. And as you say, if the government if they don't want us to exist in those small towns, well, that you'd let it run as it is. But we need to arrest that problem and address it if we're to, continue to exist out in those areas.
And if I can just add to that, the other thing, though, is banks can't do everything. One of the problems with the banks is they've taken on a particularly unfortunate risk profile.
Right.
And so trying to do this, they're trying to bring their stuff in closer, right? And what we could be doing is facilitating banks have a profile of risks, and they take on some risks which they see as a small country town, right? As part of a mixed pool, and so they spread their risks around instead of trying to do what they're currently doing. But if we go back to another area where the banks are actually very limited in what they can do, and this was the whole point behind the ARDB bill, the Australian Reconstruction and Development Board bill, which your father put into Parliament back in 2013.
I remember that well. Yeah.
Yep. Now, if a loan goes bad, the banks actually have very little way to restructure that loan under the current arrangements, right? And that bill actually went to a Senate inquiry, and I, amongst others, talked to the bankers and all this sort of stuff. And it was basically, well, we just don't think we need it, rather than any argument that it wouldn't or couldn't work. Now, where we've got to in the retail markets at the moment, what we saw in the rural areas back in 2014, and we could see again in some areas in the next couple of years, but that sort of thing is now clearly evident in the urban areas as well, where loans have been made to people at the top of a market, and where interest rates were low, and the calculations were done there, and there was no consideration of what if something went wrong, like interest rates went up, which they now have,
Yep.
right? Or the market falls, which it now is, right?
Yeah.
And we're now seeing economists from the banks and other commentators talking about a 15-20% drop in asset values from peak. We saw 30% in the rural sector from peak.
Yeah.
So this is a problem that's going to happen. Now, the banks individually can't do anything about it except ask the government to buy all their dodgy loans. They weren't dodgy when to start with necessarily, but they might not have been very careful. But they are now not serviceable. Yes. So one of the whole points of the reconstruction and development approach was that you reconstruct the loan book. And the banks can get a tax deduction for reconstructing loans. And the Reserve Bank can pass through a board and pass through, from a board using agents such as QWriter, right, to assess loans and provide a way where it could be restructured. And restructuring could include exit. It could include a new financier. It could include holding it on. There's a range of ways to do this. So I don't get into detail, but the key point is, if a loan goes bad, there's little a bank can do of itself to fix the problem. If we use something like the ARDB, we could organise so that we get a better societal and financial for the bank's outcome. Right? It was actually, hate to use the phrase, but it's actually where several parties can win and we can reduce the losses overall, and particularly for some who are caught.
Yep.
That's the sort of thing which once again is going to be needed. So markets are topped in rural areas, they're not going to stay topped. Right? Now, a 10-20% drop, equity values, loan value ratios get recalculated. Depending on the way the banks have lent, it then becomes a risk to the banks. Right? So we need to actually go through this whole process and say, loans will go wrong, we know this. So if we started right up the front with say, is the product fit for purpose? Right? If we have the situation now, we say in this climate, there'll be greater losses if the public does nothing, rather than if the government intervenes and says we can reconstruct these on a basis which is as fair and equitable as it can be. It's never going to satisfy everyone, but it will certainly leave people with more than they would currently get. And the bankers would come out with better as well, de-risk them.
Yeah, it's going to become a more important discussion to have, I think, as the time marches on in the next couple of years. Right.
Well, I think it's next much sooner, actually, the way things are heading. But, the amount of discussion is surprising me in the media about prices. 6 months ago, prices were never going to fall, were they? Now we're talking about 5, 10, and now it's now up to 15, 20%. That's a lot of shift in opinion in a short period of time, because the interest rates have rocketed up, right? And part of the reason for that is to do with the failure of the international monetary system. The Ukraine war brought in a major stress on the international financial system. So it's not just because they're worried about inflation, they're worried about the stability of the system. That's part of it.
But then, as I've heard you use the term before, but that invites in asset deflation, as you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a yeah. So you get a major deflation, and that's unfortunately what you get in a depression. A recession, the basic capital positions remain in place. People lose some income, but a depression is where the capital base gets liquidated in such a way that it actually holds back the society and the economy for years to come.
If I switch back to what's probably a smaller, broader economic problem, but very big problem for me is regional economies.
Yeah.
You go back to our little case study of the small towns now. That's always been my argument with lending or creating a lending facility, a government bank to operate in that space where there's market failure, where no one wants to lend in those small towns. I would argue you take that over those risks that banks have taken on, that aggregated risk of those volatility in the property market. I think that together has presented much more risk to the banks than doing a few loans. You know, if they were well-measured loans in some of these small towns, there's much less volatility, perhaps some decline in value over the time, but it doesn't make sense that would be seen as higher risk than those large volatile markets in metropolitan areas.
It depends upon who's doing the assessment. And unfortunately what happened was the banks got caught up in desktop evaluations.
Yep.
Right? And they didn't actually look at the enterprise. I remember, ages ago, talking to a bank manager, and he basically said, I always insist on going out and seeing the borrower in their farm or on their...
it's a big thing. Yeah.
And have a look and see how they look after it, and whether that person is committed to trying to pay back the loan. And I asked him another time where he'd been working in one of the suburbs in Sydney, and I said, "Oh, you would have had problems with loans down there?" And he said, "No, not at all. All I had to do was walk up the street and talk to an uncle or the borrower, right? And he would talk to the boy about doing that, because, as migrants, they'd never had the opportunity to have good access to capital before, and that was something they valued and was really important to achieving what they wanted in Australia. The facts that banks would lend to them if they had a good proposition, irrespective of whoever they were. And so that's what we need to go back to. We need to judge the case rather than have broad policies which encourage a particular form of lending, particularly tick the boxes and give the money away quickly. So all these things, I think, in the next few years are going to become very central points.
Yeah. Well, Mark, thanks very much for joining us. We've covered a fair bit of territory.
Yes, thanks, Robbie.
And thanks for being such an independent thinker over the years and a go-to man for anyone that wanted an alternate view outside of the mainstream sort of garbage that we've been fed up from for the last 30 years that doesn't make any sense. So thanks very much, mate. And hopefully there'll be a bit of a disruption in the economy that will start us to refocus and as you say, going back to the starting point and asking the right questions.
Yeah, and I think Australia is in a position where it could do something, right? But it has to be, how can I call it, positioned well by people who want to actually make good change. It's not going to be done by slogans. It's not going to be done by throwing another $1 billion at something else.
Yeah.
Right? It actually, we need people to think again, rather than just sort of take the status quo as must be true.
Mate, if I get anywhere near the controls, I'll be pulling you out of retirement into Treasury. And
good luck.
Fix it all up.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks again, Mark.
Okay, see you then.